Hello and welcome to Heaven's Point of View. My name is Dr. Yvonne Lewis and I have the privilege of co-hosting this series of love, marriage, sex, and divorce from the New Testament perspective with Dr. Tom Shepard. And Dr. Shepard is a professor of New Testament interpretation at Andrews University and the director of their PhD and THD religion program. So thank you so much, Dr. Shepard, for what you've been giving us in this series.
Right.
We have some very interesting information today, too, as well to share. So last time we ended up with Matthew 19:9, and we were talking about that, where Jesus talked about hard hearts and hardened hearts. Can you just kind of expand on that a little bit?
Okay, well, we noticed that the religious leaders of Jesus' day were using the Old Testament case law to make rulings allowing them to divorce their wives for a whole wide variety of reasons. And they came to Jesus to see what he thought about the matter. And we found that the case law was found in Deuteronomy 24, verses 1 to 4. We've looked at that already. And it was actually that case law back in Deuteronomy was designed to protect women, not to abuse them as the law had been twisted to mean. Now, in Jesus' day, they were using this to actually go the opposite direction of what Deuteronomy had been built for. Deuteronomy was there to protect women, and what happened by Jesus' day was they were using Deuteronomy's law as like an excuse for divorcing their wives for almost any reason at all, according to one of the schools of thought in Jesus' day. So Jesus restored the command to its original intent, and he pointed back further to creation. So what I'd like to do is to go back and read the whole passage. It's always good to just refresh and see where we've been, and maybe somebody hasn't been seeing the whole presentation, so we hear the whole passage and get it in context.
Sure.
Matthew 19, verses 3 through 12.
Verses 3 through 12. The Pharisees also came to him, testing him and saying to him, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for just any reason?" And he answered and said to them, "Have you not read that he who made them at the beginning made them male and female, and said, 'For this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh'? So then they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore what God has joined together, let not man separate." They said to him, "Why then did Moses command to give a certificate of divorce and to put her away?" He said to them, "Moses, because of the hardness of your hearts, permitted you to divorce your wives, but from the beginning it was not so. And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another commits adultery, and whoever marries her who is divorced commits adultery." His disciples said to him, "If such is the case of the man with his wife, it is better not to marry." But he said to them, "All cannot accept this saying, but only those to whom it has been given. For there are eunuchs who were born thus from their mother's womb, and there are eunuchs who were made eunuchs by men, and there are eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven's sake. He who is able to accept it, let him accept it."
Okay. Well, that last section, maybe we'll have a few minutes at the end. We can just talk about that a little bit.
I'd like a little clarification on that myself.
Last part. But right now, we're focusing in on around verses 8 and 9 to take a look at them. And we need to kind of unpack this pretty carefully, because there's a lot of questions that people will raise about what Jesus has said. The Pharisees had asked him whether it's okay to divorce your wife for any cause. And that really was linked into Deuteronomy 24, as we noted before, and their particular interpretation of it. Jesus had taken and said, well, no, you need to look back to God's plan in creation, and the creation pattern was one man and one woman, and that the man leaves his father and mother and is joined to his wife, the two become one flesh. He says, what God has joined together, let not man separate. So you're not supposed to divide up, you're supposed to stay together, just like we said from Deuteronomy, that, I'm sorry, not Deuteronomy, but from Malachi, God says, I hate divorce. Okay? So then this brings them to their question in response to him. They say, well, then why did Moses command us to give a certificate of divorce. And the perceptive reader will notice that Jesus says, well, it was because of the hardness of your heart that Moses allowed you to divorce. He permitted it. It wasn't a command.
Right, so there was no real command for divorce.
Correct. In fact, throughout the Bible, there is no command to divorce. We noted that there's two different kinds of law. One is called apodictic. That's a great word, apodictic law.
Has a ring to it.
It has a ring to it. The other one is case law. Apodictic law is a law that applies to everybody in all situations. So this is like the 10 Commandments.
Okay.
Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Don't commit adultery. Don't steal. Those things apply to everybody at all times in all situations. Then you have things that are case law. They say, well, if a man's ox breaks down his neighbor's fence and goes and eats his corn, then you should do this.
Right.
Right. So that's a particular case situation that it deals with.
Specifically targeting certain situations.
Yeah, certain situations. So we've said that there is no command in apodictic law in the Bible to divorce. It's an important concept. There's no one of these overall things. Because why? Because divorce is not God's plan for our marriages. You see, he says don't commit adultery. That's apodictic law. But there's only case law that deals with the question of divorce. So Deuteronomy 24 actually assumes the presence of divorce. And then it makes a law in order to control the bad situations that result from it. Okay, it's not there to say that divorce is okay. It's there to minimize the bad effects of divorce that were already present in their society. It's like we say in Christian theology, what is needed is not a change of partner. What is needed is a change of heart. Okay, so our hearts need to be converted, and you can learn to love. You can learn to love again. If you fell into love, or you make a choice about love and then you came to the place where you didn't love your spouse anymore, you can learn to love again.
And you know, that's an interesting point, Dr. Shepherd, because sometimes you hear a spouse say, well, I just don't love my husband or my wife anymore. I just don't feel that anymore. And what you're saying is, you can, well, I hear you saying a few things. Number one, you can get that again. If you had it before, you can have it again.
Yes.
And it is a choice.
It is a choice. Yeah, love is a choice. And remember, we talked about before, sometime back in these programs, about the meaning of how the Bible uses the term love when it says to love God with all your heart, to love your neighbors as yourself. Those were not just romantic, those were not romantic kind of concepts. Now, some people will say, yeah, but marriage is supposed to be all romantic. Well, it's romantic, but there's more than the romance, you know. There's a certain choice you make to affirm and to support and to bless the other person around you. We should note that in this whole dispute with Jesus, there were two different schools of thought that we've talked about, the school of Hillel and the school of Shammai. These were schools of thought among the religious leaders of Jesus' day. And the school of Hillel said that they would let you have divorce for almost any reason. You could burn the toast and you could get a divorce. School of Shammai said only for sexual immorality. Now, we might suppose that what would happen is there'd be a lot more people flocking to the school of Hillel and getting divorces, you know, because they were unhappy. But what happened was the school of Hillel, they lengthened the process for getting a divorce, which made it, you know, harder to do, where the process was more simple in the school of Shammai because their standard was higher. So the two schools had a certain
pros and cons.
You cannot destroy marriages and expect a society to stay healthy.
That's very true.
You know, and we in America, and we in the church in America, of all people, need to understand this, and we need to help make changes about this, because our society is having more and more trouble with this. All right, now this brings us to verse 9. So let's read verse 9 one more time.
Okay, verse 9 says, "And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another commits adultery, and whoever marries her who is divorced commits adultery."
All right, now this statement of Jesus, people study it and study it and study it, and they parse it and pull it apart. And we're going to talk about some of that kind of relationship, but let's just focus in on the basic components and make sure we get the basic message. If you divorce and then except for sexual immorality and marry another, that's the same as adultery. Jesus had a formula, you might say. Divorce plus remarriage equals adultery, unless there's sexual immorality involved. Now, exactly what does he mean when he uses this term, sexual immorality or porneia? We'll have to unpack that a little bit. But Jesus is very much against divorce. Now, is it the same as adultery to just get divorced? No.
No.
The answer is no. A person who has divorced is a tragedy. It's a tragic situation, but it is not adultery. So they haven't like broken one of the 10 Commandments when they do that. Now, we have a tendency, I don't know why it is, but we have a tendency as humans to look down on people who have been divorced. And sometimes the divorce happens because no fault of their own does it occur. The other person just, went off and just departed and just, created a situation that caused great heartache in their home. They didn't want that, but we always tend to look and say, well, yeah, but they're probably to blame, and we in the church need to step back and say, you know what? Doesn't matter what happened. We got to love them. We got to care for them. We got to support them. Now, if they need to commit, if they need to repent of their sin and say, I did something wrong, they need to confess that. That's part of Christian life as well.
Right.
Right? But Jesus' statement here, divorce by itself is not described as adultery. Divorce is not the will of God, but if one remains single afterwards, it does not call for censure by the community of faith. It seems divorce is its own censure.
That is very true.
Yeah.
After divorce, many times you find that people kind of tend to take sides.
They do.
And then if you had friends as a couple prior to your divorce, then who's still your friend and who's not?
Yeah.
So it is its own censure.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's true.
Okay, so now we've got to walk through a little bit about what goes on here and press forward. Sometimes, not always, sometimes to remarry after divorce is the same as committing adultery, okay? Why would that be? Probably because the first marriage was not dissolved in accordance with the will of God, and thus to remarry would be the same as committing adultery against the first spouse. Okay, so we have to think about this. Now, there's a linkage here to Deuteronomy 24. Jesus' statement does not affirm divorce. In the Torah, we've already noted, there are no apodictic divorce laws.
Right.
And it wasn't God's will for them to divorce, and so Deuteronomy 24 limited the damage that was there. Now, when we come to Jesus' exception clause, he says, except for the case of porneia, or sexual immorality. What does he mean? Okay. Sexual immorality, this term, it was a bit of a flexible term. It could mean having sexual intercourse with somebody who's not your spouse, okay, in general. It could also mean incest, having sex with a child in your family. Sex with a prostitute is the way the term is used, sometimes porneia, okay? The question is, what is the meaning here in Matthew 19? The linkage to Deuteronomy 24 in the context of the Pharisees' question to Jesus is helpful in this regard. Okay? Their question arose from the debate between the two schools of Hillel and Shammai. Now, they were both looking at the same Old Testament text,
right?
Deuteronomy 24, and they came across a phrase that we translate as a matter of indecency. A matter of indecency, okay? Now, the two different schools focused on the two different terms. The School of Hillel focused on the term matter. Matter of indecency. So they said you could divorce for any cause. It's a matter of indecency. Matter. The School of Shammai focused on the word indecency. It's a matter of indecency. Okay, to kind of put it in colloquial terms, or kind of terms that is easier to understand. So they focused on, one focused on the word matter, and the other focused on the word indecency. That Matthew has the term porneia would suggest that Jesus comes down actually on the School of Shammai side, that it's a matter of indecency, that porneia is the indecency, which is the sexual immorality. It has some kind of sexual evil involved here where somebody has done something sexually wrong. So the question is, what does Jesus affirm here? All right? He says that marriage has a divine component, right? It is not simply a contract between a man and a woman. It is a link to God. God is the one who affirms the marriage when it takes place. So it's not just a contract between people. So it has this divine component. Jesus acknowledges the shift that took place under Moses. He said he permitted this. It wasn't something he commanded. It wasn't God's will, but it was because of hard hearts that this took place. That cannot be God's ideal. God doesn't want hard hearts. God wants changed hearts.
Right.
Right? He calls people back to creation order. He says that from the beginning it wasn't that way, and he calls them back to live as God wanted them. But then he has this exception, is the allowance for release from a marriage commitment based on gross moral failure. So he's not doing it for light matters like Hillel would. It has to be something serious, okay, that has taken place. This actually is also not a command. That's very important to notice. He doesn't say you have to get divorced if your spouse has been sleeping with somebody else.
Right.
He doesn't say you have to get that. He says you can, but you do not have to. Sexual sin can be forgiven. Divorce is not required. But it is allowed on these grounds. If the hard-hearted refers to the person who committed adultery, then the release given to the innocent party is justice in the face of sinful defiance. Somebody who will not change. They will not repent. Okay?
So that is, if you're in a marriage with someone who is a serial adulterer and you keep saying, look, I can't deal with this anymore, and the person just continues on, then you do have biblical grounds to
divorce. Right. So if the hard-hearted is actually the innocent party, some people take it that way, that it refers to the innocent party, calling them to forgive, then Jesus' command goes beyond even the School of Shammai, where they say it is a command to divorce such people when they commit adultery, then you divorce them. Jesus indicates that while it is permitted, that was not God's original idea, and he wants healing, and it is the innocent party who has the ability, by the grace of God, to actually bring healing by forgiving the offender. Of course, if the offender doesn't repent, there's an interesting thing that we can stop and mention here, and that's the issue of forgiveness. Forgiveness sets us free from the control of the sin that has come into our life or into the life of other people. If that person still isn't repentant, if you forgive them, it sets you free from their control in your life.
That's right.
Yeah, and it's a deep topic, it's a deep thought, but it's a hard thought. I have seen that to forgive somebody when they've really done you really wrong. Now, you know, if they just did some minor small thing that's like nothing, but I mean, if they really did something really terrible to you, and they're not sorry for it, that's the hardest situation. But if you forgive them, then you're saying, you're recognizing that it's wrong, because you don't forgive something that's not wrong. You're recognizing that it's wrong, but you're actually giving it over to God and letting him take care of your life. This is so important in so many aspects of life.
It is, because it holds you in its grip. If you don't forgive, the anger and all of that holds you in its grip, and it has power and control over you. But once you release it and you give it to the Lord and you ask the Lord to give you a spirit of forgiveness, it sets you free.
That's right.
It's really not so much for the other person, it's for you.
And what I've discovered is that when they've done you wrong, really badly wrong, you have to forgive them over and over again. You know, Jesus one time said to Peter that Peter said, how many times should I forgive my brother if he sins against me? Up to 7 times? And he said, no, 70 times 7. And we say, well, that's just like, you know, don't stop counting kind of a thing. Well, I've kind of discovered a new meaning for that. It's like sometimes when somebody has really done you wrong, you have to forgive them 490 times for it to sink into your own life, into your own heart, you know, to kind of settle into you, and that you say, yeah, I know, you know, I have forgiven. And that's by the grace of God, you know, but it's something you sort of go over it over and over again. And these kind of hurts can really take a long time to heal.
Yes, they
and
can.
Again, we in the church should be thoughtful of such things. All right, now, this exception clause is rather challenging sometimes. It's kind of expressed in several different ways, and so people wonder, what does it really refer to? A man who marries an invalidly divorced woman commits adultery. If you follow the same passage in Luke 16, or you look at Matthew 5, you see this. Anyone in Jewish society would agree with this position. In fact, in Judaism, if a woman accidentally married 2 men, she was treated as an adulteress, even if the fault were not hers.
Wow.
Which doesn't seem right, but that was the kind of the thing. So a man who married an invalidly divorced woman commits adultery. A man who invalidly divorces his wife causes her to commit adultery. There seems to be a nuance of that in Matthew 5 and again in Matthew 19. In Matthew 5, if the woman remarries and thereby commits adultery, then her former husband seems to be partly to blame, because he shouldn't have divorced her in the first place, kind of a thing, see? Another way of looking at this exception clause has to do with the idea that a man who invalidly divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery. This kind of turns it the other direction. And Mark chapter 10 and Matthew 19 and Luke 16 all seem to have some of that kind of flavor. What I'm doing here is I'm actually talking about comparing the different ways that Jesus talks about divorce in the Synoptic Gospels.
Right.
And sometimes people worry about that, you know, it's not exactly the same words here and it is there, you know. But actually, if you were to take people into court, you know, 4 witnesses into court, and they all said exactly the same thing about an accident, you would say, I think they were outside, they were talking together and making the story up.
Right.
But when we come to the 4 Gospels and we find that they say things, you know, not quite exactly the same, it doesn't exactly match, we say, oh no, but we can't trust the Bible then. Really? It should make us trust it more, because it's not exactly the same, and it doesn't, you know, they don't exactly match up. It's more like 4 witnesses that are, you know, presenting the information. Okay, so over in Mark and in Luke, and even in Matthew 19, a man who invalidly divorces his wife, so he's at fault now, and marries another, commits adultery. For Jews, this would be difficult to accept, actually, because in Jesus' day, it was technically impossible for a man to commit adultery by marrying an unmarried woman, because polygamy was allowed.
Right.
That also wasn't God's ideal.
Right.
But that's some of what could happen. But Jesus taught that marriage should be monogamous. He puts together the text from Genesis 1 and 2, and he says male and female, and the 2 become one flesh. So since for Jesus there's only monogamy, an invalid divorce followed by remarriage would be adultery against the first and only wife. All right? Now, there's another case, if you look at Mark 10, a woman who invalidly divorces her husband and marries another commits adultery. This is just saying now it's the woman who's doing the divorce.
Right, right.
Now, some people want to say that, Mark must have made this up because in Jesus' day, women couldn't divorce their husbands in Judaism. Well, you know what? If you look in the Gospels, you will find a lady named Herodias. She was married to a guy named Philip. And then she divorces her husband Philip, and she marries Herod.
Right.
And obviously that took place in in the context of Palestine, all right? So the Herodian women actually did this, all right? So when Jesus says a woman who invalidly divorces her husband, marries another and commits adultery, he might be winking and saying, yeah, don't forget that Herodias did that, okay? Now, the exception clause is really the clue to why Jesus said the divorce is invalid when somebody does this. Matthew 5 and 19 have the exception clause. Mark 10 and Luke do not. And people wonder about that. Well, why not? In the first century, in a Jewish setting of discussing divorce, the question about the school of Hillel and the school of Shammai would have been the matter of discussion that they would be saying about when they talked about divorce. So the new Hillel ruling that you could divorce your wife for any cause, okay, did not require any valid grounds for the divorce and allowed divorce for any reason. Therefore, when contemporary Jews heard the question, is it lawful to divorce your wife? They would have mentally added the words, for any reason. Because that's what Hillel was talking about. Similarly, when they heard the reply, whoever divorces his wife, they would have mentally added the phrase, except for valid grounds. It's not unlike reading Matthew 5, when Jesus, we talked about this before, looking at a woman lustfully and everything, okay? I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart. The missing implied phrase is except for his own wife.
Right.
It's all right to look at your wife that way.
Right.
You know, in fact, we used to say it's encouraged, you know?
Yeah.
So from our previous thoughts, we can say Jesus calls divorce invalid if and when there are no valid grounds. But what does that mean? The contextual meaning, and we're running out of time, the contextual meaning of this, we can just kind of summarize in this way since we're short on time. Jesus taught that marriage is for life. He opposed divorce, but he taught that there are valid and invalid reasons for divorce. The valid reasons are in the case of when somebody is sexually, has sex with somebody other than their spouse. Sex with someone other than a spouse permits but does not require divorce. Divorce for invalid reasons plus remarriage is the same as adultery.
And that really basically summarizes what he's saying in Matthew 19.
Yeah.
It is critical for us to really study this and ask for the Holy Spirit's guidance on it, because so many people are contemplating divorce.
Yeah.
And before doing it, really, we need to really get in the Word. I know, because I've been divorced, and it's not an easy journey. But for those of you who are married and contemplating divorce, get into the Word and tune in next time as we continue to unpack these wonderful topics from our Word.
Okay.